Hey, Push Nation, welcome in. And here we are talking today about the New Deal and some Supreme Court cases that impacted the New Deal, along with other cases that I want to make sure you guys have an awareness were important in the context of the 1920s and 30s. So let's start with the New Deal. We haven't gone into everything about the alphabet soup programs, but a couple that I got into today in class, the NRA and the NIRA, two watershed first New Deal acts of legislation passed by Congress at the urging of FDR, which were designed to regulate and to really have full government or a great government control over the economy through business and industry. Those two acts would be struck down by the Supreme Court, which was a predominantly Republican Supreme Court. Don't forget about the fact that during the 1920s, 3 straight Republican presidents. So therefore, the Republican court was stacked by those presidents. And that would cause FDR some consternation as he tried to navigate the waters of getting these New Deal acts of legislation to stay and remain in position to assist the process of relief, recovery, and reform. The case that you need to know for the NRA and the NIRA's demise is the Schechter Poultry Company versus United States. Schechter Poultry Company. Poultry, think of chicken. So this one business challenged the NIRA as constitutionality and the NRA's constitutionality, and the company won on the grounds that the federal government had overstepped its rights to regulate business and industry. So the court case came in 1935. So this is right towards the end of Roosevelt's first term as president. And the case came down, and it's part of what's known as Black Monday, in which this case came out. And Black Monday refers to the fact that 2 of Roosevelt's most crucial New Deal legislative acts were struck down by the Supreme Court, and they were rendered unconstitutional. So massive blow to Roosevelt and the Democrats. The other New Deal legislation that was swiftly taken down was the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Agency. And the AAA, much like the NRA and the NIRA, heavily regulated agricultural practices. But the AAA was also declared unconstitutional in 1937. So 3 of Roosevelt's most important New Deal acts of legislation, 3 of the most important alphabet soup programs were sliced and cut down by the Supreme Court. So how does Roosevelt react to this? Well, he didn't just cry in the corner. He came back with vengeance. And when he was re-elected president in one of the most landmark elections in history in 1936, I'll show you the results tomorrow, Roosevelt began an aggressive measure to revise the number of Supreme Court justices on the Supreme Court. Now, since 1869, Congress, which of course regulates the federal court system, Congress had passed an act that said you'd have 8 justices and 1 chief justice. Roosevelt urged Congress, which was still largely Democratic, to give Roosevelt increased power to add more justices, as far as up to 15 justices to the Supreme Court. And the act went further. I'm sorry, I just hit the camera. The act went further that any judge that was over 70 years, for every judge that was over 70 years old, Roosevelt could add a new one. So think about that. That would give Roosevelt the chance to add up to 15 justices on the Supreme Court. And this becomes known as something called court packing. Underline it, star it. It's an important anecdote. It's an important aspect of the New Deal struggles. And we're going to talk more about that tomorrow because, again, not everything for Roosevelt was always peaches and cream. Some aspects of the New Deal were challenged in the courts with the Schechter case that struck down the NRA and the NIRA, and then the defeat of the AAA. So Roosevelt's New Deal legislation was under attack. And tomorrow in class, we'll talk more about how it was also under attack by politicians and other sort of populist movement leaders that tried to strike back at Roosevelt's overexpansion of the federal government in the New Deal. Now, we're going to take a quick break, and I want to transfer over into talking about 2 court cases. Now, one I admittedly missed, and I want to retrace my steps, if you don't mind, going back to the 1920s. And I missed this when we were talking about the 20s and mass culture. I blatantly just missed this, and I don't want to miss this for the exam. Because it really gets into something that was going on in the 1920s and 30s which was really the Third Great Awakening. And during the Third Great Awakening, this whole conflict that evolved was the issue of modernity versus fundamentalism. And modernity and fundamentalism. So the thing that's important to know about this battle was that Darwin's theory of evolution, which had come about in the late 1800s, had begun to infiltrate schools. And many schools, especially in the Deep South, remained very fundamentalist, meaning hardcore Christian values. And in Christian values, the question of evolution and modernity is right in the forefront of some of the debates that still exist today in this country about modernity and fundamentalism. Now, religious fundamentalists tried to rebuke the attempts of evolution being taught in the schools. And so this whole matter eventually worked its way into an important court case, which became known infamously as the Scopes trial. John Scopes was a school teacher in Tennessee who violated a Tennessee law that made it unlawful to teach evolution in schools. So Scopes, the teacher, violates the law. And he actually did this on purpose because he was trying to draw attention to the fact that this Tennessee law existed. So what happened is eventually this goes to trial, not at the Supreme Court, but at the state level in Tennessee. But this became a national sensation. The Scopes trial drew some of the biggest legal minds in the world. In fact, William Jennings Bryan, remember him, our old hero of the gold standard and silver standard battle and perpetual presidential election loser? William Jennings Bryan came to the defense as the lawyer for John Scopes. Meanwhile, on the side of fundamentalism and the state was a famous lawyer named Charles Darrow. Now, the whole Scopes trial came down to one issue. Fundamentalism, that's religious Christian groups and religious Christian interests versus modernity and science, and that was represented by Scopes. Ultimately, the court sided with the law. It upheld the Tennessee law about fundamentalism. But in this Third Great Awakening movement of fundamentalism, the Scopes trial drew national and international attention. And I wanted to make sure I got that in here today before I wrap up, because it could come up as a potential topic for popular culture of the 1920s, something that we talked a great deal about before spring break. But another case, and this one's in the 1930s, so it's in the Depression New Deal era. And this one has longstanding effect on highlighting the racial segregation issues that were still ongoing in the South, and that's the Scottsboro Boys trial. The Scottsboro Boys trial was a case that involved a number of African-American young men, that were accused of raping two white girls. And in the Deep South, we've already talked about how blatantly racist and hostile attitudes were towards African Americans. 9 young men were ultimately convicted of raping these girls, even though evidence demonstrated that they were not guilty. And over time, the boys would eventually be given new trials. But the first trial, they were convicted. And there was a lot of sensationalism attached to the Scottsboro Boys trial, which took place, by the way, in 1932. And ultimately, here's the importance of this case and how it relates to the Supreme Court. Ultimately, the lawyers for the Scottsboro Boys, the young men, the 9 young men that were convicted of rape, appealed the decisions all the way to the Supreme Court. And in the case Powell versus Alabama, Powell was one of the Scottsboro Boys. Powell versus Alabama, the court basically reasoned that the right to retain representation for a lawyer was crucial in getting a fair trial. What they ultimately argued was that the Scottsboro Boys did not receive fair trials, primarily because you had all white juries and the lawyers for the boys were not always appointed in a fair manner. And so the court held that the 14th Amendment due process was not upheld in the Scottsboro Boys trial. Therefore, the boys were given new trials. Now, some of them would still be convicted. And over time, a lot of them received pardons, and a lot of them, their sentences were commuted. So even though the Supreme Court says they needed to have a retrial, the bottom line is that this case magnified the racial tensions that we already have talked about with the Deep South. And the fact that this case went to the Supreme Court helped elevate it into the national conscience of American people. And so the Scottsboro boys and the Scopes trial, these are two popular culture cases that you should be aware of for the 1920s and 1930s, and coupling that with the controversy of FDR's court packing and the defeat of three key legislative programs of the New Deal are really relevant for you guys to understand and have a full grasp of what's going on in the New Deal era and the tension that erupted in American courts. It's a short one tonight, so you're welcome for that. And I look forward to the student-produced ones that will be coming out next week. I hope everybody has a nice Wednesday night. Remember, the past shapes the future. Take care, APUSH Nation.